I am. Say, this is Wilfred Reilly, and you're watching the Break It Down Show.
This is Wilfred Reilly, and you're watching the Break It Down Show.
Yes, we're doing it. We're doing another one of these Thomas Sowell deep dives. The book today is Will popped away. Oh, you're back. Okay, good.
Yeah, I'm right here.
Yeah. So your book that we're talking about today is Thomas Sowell's Race and Culture. It is from the mid-90s. And I guess before we start, I wanted to ask you something, because this goes into the overall theme that Sowell often talks about, the quality or any presence of data, any rigor within that data, the ability to control for certain things, age, etc. Is there a mass attack or a mass threat to trans people that you can see in the data? I mean, we're seeing all this cataclysmic talk, and we have to support these things. You're saying no.
Yeah, no, I should probably redo this article, but one of my first kind of public sector quantitative pieces was for Claire Lehman at Quillette. And we actually just sat down and looked at that data. Like, I requested it from the Human Rights Campaign, as I recall, or got it somehow. Chase Geyser, if I have the name correct, looked at it too. But I mean, in a typical year, there were some incredibly low number, like 17 to 40 murders of trans people. Now about 2% of the USA identifies as trans or non-binary. So you can just break that rate down. And it was lower than the murder rate for blacks. It was lower than the murder rate for poor whites. Now, both of those are pretty high, but like, it was lower than the murder rate for men in general. Obviously, trans women are male. So no, like, what you found with the trans cases was the same phenomenon that you found with the Black Lives Matter deaths, which is that you had a very small subset of cases, and almost every one of them went at least locally viral. And that created the impression that there were a lot, because the normal person's impression is, well, the media can't just be taking every case where a black criminal is killed by a cop and making that famous. This has to be a small chunk of, a larger data set. But that wasn't the case. I mean, with BLM, it was every case. There are about 12 unarmed black men shot by cops every year. And it's the same thing with the transgender cases. I mean, there's a very low rate of trans violence. The other thing with the trans cases was that most of the trans people who were killed weren't killed by Nazis or by bigots, by black activists or something like that. They were killed because they were sex workers and someone discovered they were trans, or not even someone discovered they were trans. Someone thought they'd been overcharged or something like this, and there was a stabbing or there was a shooting, or there was a domestic violence situation where a partner who could be gay or straight, is involved in a fight, just as you often get with women classic, if you will. So yeah, no, there's no epidemic of psychotic violence against trans people. The murder rate for trans people, trans women, quote unquote, is lower than the murder rate for men.
So no, only back to the beginning. Why does this narrative hold up? What is it about? And this goes right into the race and culture thing. Why does one part of our culture hold on so tightly to these things that are not empirically true?
Well, this is a really interesting question, actually. So, I mean, first of all, I think that the ability to believe things that are pretty dubious goes back a really long time if you look at religion and so on down the line. So I don't necessarily think liberals are more inclined to believe nonsense than conservatives. I think right now what you've got is a weird situation in the media and academia where both of those slant, I mean, more than 90% to the political left. So Pew back in 2004 did this very famous study. Actually, I'm going to have to, God damn.
All right. Well, Will is trying to figure out, and this could be my side as well. I'm not sure where the Wi-Fi problem is, but we'll just keep going. It could be that he's there. It could be that he is not there. And I don't know what's going on. All right. Well, we'll just assume that I'm the one talking because we can't tell. Apparently, Wi-Fi is going to be a challenge today, which is fine. One of the things that I wanted to bring up next was Charles Murray has these 3 laws. And so I'll set this up so that we can use this when we get back here. But I'm good. Will, not so good. Okay, good. Well, that's good from Brad. Brad lets us know that he's not so good. So the thing about, if you don't know who Charles Murray is, I'm going to put the link up here. Hold on. So that's the link. It's in the on YouTube side and on the Facebook side. And it talks about Murray's three laws of social programs. And basically, you have the law of imperfect selection and the objective of the rule that defines eligibility for social transfer programs rationally exclude some persons who were the program is designed for. The law of unintended rewards. Any social transfer increases the net value of being in the condition that is promoted the transfer. So you will actually create more of the people with the problem. And then the law of new harm or net harm. And the less likely it is that the unwanted behavior will change voluntarily, the more likely the program will include to cause the harm. Okay, Will is back.
Yeah, so we're
yeah.
using these campus provided computers in the faculty offices. My bad. Anyway, so I've just replaced it with my own machine. Anywho, so basically, in terms of why people believe all this stuff, people believe these things because they're told them. So I don't want to get repetitious with this in like every one of my speeches, but one of all this finding a couple of years back that the average black man or the average urban white man thought that the total number of unarmed black guys that were shot by cops every year was between 1,000 and 10,000. And this was like a major large end study. This was Skeptic Research Center. As I recall, about 35% of males thought it was about 1,000, quote unquote. Another 15% thought it was about 10,000, and 8% thought it was more than that. And again, the total number of unarmed black people or black men that are shot every year by cops is 12. It's 10 to 30 at the very upper end. There are less than 100 unarmed people total that are killed by police or shot by police in a typical year. So people believe this because they see certain content coming at them constantly from the media, right? I mean, so like this past month we've seen Banco Brown, Jordan Neely, and all these cases are presented as extremely sympathetic. I mean, Jordan Neely was a dancing, smiling Michael Jackson impersonator, a beloved subway entertainer. I mean, in reality, Jordan Neely, no disrespect to the dead, but was a druggy vagrant. I mean, he'd been charged with 42 previous felonies. He punched an old lady in the face and fractured her skull, like the orbital bone and the front of the brain pan. On another occasion, he tried to kidnap a small child. But the presentation of these stories is that there's an endless sequence of sympathetic people that are killed by a supremacist, prejudiced society. And that can go in the LGBT direction, that can go in the Black Lives Matter direction, but it's all part of a broader narrative. Why is the narrative common? I mean, again, it's what I was going to say before I was cut off, is that very famously Pew polled national media journalists and found that only 7% of them were conservatives, libertarians, center right, which is probably where you and I would fall, anything businessmanish. The other 93% were leftists, liberals, or left-leaning moderates, and I guess Marxists would go in there. So just like, if the entire media were Fox from 2007, you'd have a lot of stories about pretty blonde women getting killed by illegal migrants or whatever. With the media as it is now, you get a lot of these BS stories. I like Brad's comment. Actually, doing things with small children is consistent with beloved Michael Jackson impersonator. Yeah, when I saw that the guy's favorite artist was Michael Jackson and he said that he liked everything about Michael Jackson and so on, that didn't make him more sympathetic to me. But it did give the media their image, right? Like Jordan Neely in the braided coat with the epaulettes on his shoulders. He was a pretty good dancer, so there are videos of dancing in the subway. But all that eludes the actual point, elides the actual point, which is that Neely wasn't killed for dancing. He'd fallen deeper into drugs. He hadn't impersonated Jackson apparently for about a year. He was killed because he got into a violent fight with a Marine on a subway train after threatening to kill everyone on the train. So you can have this over here and say, well, it's a pity, a talented artist had a drug problem, but that has nothing to do with this over here, which is why, the young man lost his life. So again, these stories are very dishonest. These stories are presented as though they're part of a sweeping problem when they're not. The question is just why that happens. And that is just because of bias in the media. And lessons, but I don't really think obviously I'm a man of the right, I'm a business guy, but if the entire media were OAN, no offense, I've been on that network, but we'd see the same thing from the right.
Oh, sure.
It would be every illegal migrant who looks kind of Arabic would be on camera, the border, day 147 of our news team at the border, so that's just a reality. But when you have this extreme bias, it's important to be aware of it. And the average like CNN upper middle class mom is not aware of that. They just think that the fear they're hearing is reality.
Yeah. Well, and again, this feeds into the overall the book Race and Culture by Thomas Sowell. I found a review from about 30 years ago on the book, and it talks about Thomas Sowell's half-baked comparison. I'm quoting here: half-baked comparisons of world ethnic groups and nationalities that pepper his conservative analysis. And then it goes on. And then it kind of closes out and says, Sowell, they're quoting now. Thomas Sowell says, by Jews, Germans, and Asians as to the public sector route favored by the Irish and blacks. He owes it to the reader, however, to explain that the latter groups, and these are being like latter groups like the traditionally modern oppressed groups, right? So Latinos and that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. The latter groups choose the political route precisely because they were denied opportunity in business. Moreover, while making the point that imperialism provides colonies with physical infrastructure, he is silent about what imperialism took the colonies' natural resources and political autonomy. So this goes into the third chapter and in general some of the other stuff he talks about. But I don't think I think he covers the point of what happens when you are dominated and someone else comes in, whether it's middlemen or Chinese into Malaysia. Can you talk a little bit about the lack? This sounds like I don't ever hear that Thomas Sowell was half-baked. This is a 30-year-old review, so maybe someone's gotten better at this, but is half-baked an accurate way to say this?
No, I mean, I think Thomas Sowell is probably top 10 among American social scientists of his era. He's become an icon on the right because he's someone who's coming at this from a quantitative center right to right standpoint, and that's why I like him. But no, I don't think anyone seriously thinks Thomas Sowell, who made Arthur Jensen step back a bit in the IQ debate and so on, is points on both sides there, I'm sure. But I don't think anyone thinks he's a half-baked or incompetent scholar at all. I mean, to address kind of some of those specific points, we often see kind of post hoc results presented as privilege or as evidence of the existence at baseline of opportunity. So that comment like the blacks and the Irish had no choice but to take the public route, the groups they're being compared to are Chinese Americans and Jews. So I'm not really sure that makes any sense at all. I mean, the level of bias against Asians and Jews in the West or on the East Coast was very much on par with the level of bias against Irishmen, and for that matter, with the level of bias against blacks in the North. So yeah, I mean, what the person who's making that point is saying is that the simple fact that group A chose to do X and group B chose to do Y is evidence of greater discrimination against the first group. And that is not in fact correct. We know empirically that there were almost identical levels of discrimination against all four groups. And that gets into the point of the book. Thanks to Charles, by the way. Enjoyed your appearance with Ed Dutton. I went on the Jolly Heretic podcast. That's another great podcast, long break it down show. Lipton Matthews, the Jamaican academic, was on there. I think we need more of those kind of multinational crossovers when it comes to thinkers talking about this stuff. But I mean, this actually gets into the point of Sowell's book. So Race and Culture is a book where Sowell makes a point that would be bog obvious to a group of smart dudes sitting around in a bar or on a golf course, barbershop, but that's utterly taboo in social science, which is that different groups have different cultures, and some of them are situationally better than others. Right. So, I mean, there are really three perspectives in social science, and none of these are evil. The two extremes, I'm a culturalist myself, but the two other extremes tend to hate one another, but none of them are inherently evil or malign. But there's hereditarianism, which argues that certainly when you look at things like physical performance, there are genetic differences between groups. So to give the hereditarians their case, they would make the point that every world marathoning champion in history, as I can recall, modern integrated history, has come from one 200 square mile area between Somalia, Kenya, Algeria. I mean, like in northeastern Africa. So there are genetic differences between groups. Then there is what we are all supposed to pretend adherence to today, which is what you could call Keynesianism, which is the argument that outside sociological factors, particularly racism, are pretty much the only thing that predict how groups perform. And that's what we're looking at with your blacks and Irishmen example. It's the argument that if blacks did worse than Chinese Americans, we don't even need to look at the levels of reported racism by blacks and Chinese Americans because the explanation is racism. And then third, there's culturalism, which has fallen out of fashion to some extent, even though in my opinion, it's obviously the most correct of the three philosophies, because hereditarians on the hard right don't really want it. It's kind of the ancient enemy. And the people on the center left and center right who would normally say, well, that's obviously true, are now supposed to pretend there are no differences between people at all, if that makes sense. But Sowell in this book, and that's why we picked it as the third one, I think we both agreed on it,
Yeah.
goes through this magisterial breakdown of all these cultures and says, well, if you take 32 or whatever it is points of, cultural dichotomy between groups, attitudes toward education, toward policing, liquor consumption, vegetarian diet. I mean, it's pretty empirical. You can see that these groups wildly differ on all these points. So to pick just a silly, glib example, among groups with relatively similar tested IQs at this point, let's say Albanians, Black West Indians, and Irishmen, you would expect Irishmen to set up far more bars. And in fact, that's what you see, to the point where 173 years later, after that wave of immigration started, the Irish pub is a stereotype almost everywhere in the world. And that's culture. What is that thing that can last 150 years, which is 8 generations, that we identify with specific groups? Why would you know that an Irishman not wearing orange is almost certainly a Catholic? Well, those are the cultural patterns that people have. And so this book is devoted to breaking down what some of those are. I mean, there's a chapter, race, culture, and history, looking at formation of this. I mean, you've got race, culture, and intelligence, and just on and on and on through all of the chapters of the book.
Yeah, you think about, if not Irish, like a guy like Pierman Zurbriggen, who grows up in Switzerland, and his dad is an innkeeper at the base of a mountain. It turns out it's a pretty good chance that you culturally will develop a better ability to ski at the world championship level. It's just not a lot of skiers come from Yemen. They have mountains there, but it's just not the same setup. And so geography. Yeah, go ahead.
No, you actually, what were you going to say?
Well, I said geography even matters with culture, right? Like if you have, and Sowell is noted for saying that Africa has a shortage of rivers and navigable ports and coastline that's less than Europe's, right? And so you have these problems that create different solutions, or maybe deny you the access to other things, and that's just geography. Like if you live in a mountain village in the Alpine country, and your dad runs an inn, you're going to have some free time to go ski more than somebody who lives in, again, Yemen in the Middle East, where there's a lot of turmoil and strife because there's not enough of anything there.
Yeah, and I think that's an extremely good illustration of a cultural point that's impossible to peg to genetics or to racism. If you look at the best skiers in the world in the Winter Olympics, almost all of them are going to be from a small subset of Northwestern European countries that have mountains. And again, that might sound kind of silly, but we're talking about the gold medal winners in the world's elite athletic competition. Every one of them is going to fit this profile. And that's because the precondition, which is that you've got these high areas of land with snow and ice on them, is found only there. And you see this stuff throughout a whole lot of different examples or case studies that you could look at in society. So, I mean, in the United States, the NBA, the National Basketball Association, is about 75% Black, mostly African American. The National Hockey League, which plays in literally the same arenas and where people compete on an athletic surface that's almost exactly the same size, is, I think, 97% white. And it's really, really hard to attribute that gap. Certainly it's not due to racism, but it's really, really hard to attribute that gap to genes. Like my guess would just be most hockey players are from the north in the USA, or from Canada, or from Finland, from other places where you have fucking ice on the water. So in the winter, you can go out and you can play some pond hockey if you're a working class kid. And you also have the one hockey rink in town and so on. You have the outdoor hockey rink when it gets really cold and so on. So the people that have the ability to play hockey are almost entirely at a high level, are almost entirely going to be people who got their 10,000 hours in fairly early in life in that environment. Yeah, and Sowell gives dozens of examples of this sort of thing. Like
just go ahead.
No, but I mean, just like almost every well-known beer in the world was initially brewed by Germans, for example. And I think the great man probably enjoyed during his travels sampling some of these beers because he lists like 15 beers. But I mean, like this is the case for Tsingtao from China, for example. This is the case, a mix of Germans and Englishmen for Tusker from Kenya. It's the case in situations where you would never expect this to occur because there's that enormous cultural preset that one group happened to have. And it's worth noting that this sort of thing hasn't stopped in the modern era. I mean, there's an entire set of articles on Asian study culture, which finds that Asian American kids, as versus Black or white kids, simply spend more time studying and working on schoolwork. Like, whether you think there's some small genetic baseline difference, that's another question. But there's this very empirical, very hard body of research that finds that Asian kids spend an hour plus more per day than, say, Blacks or Southern whites with the books. And they're not just doing homework, which is a common deflector here. I mean, they're doing flashcards, they're reading ahead, they're doing like spelling games with their parents. Almost all of the recent champions in the U.S. National Spelling Bee have been Indian American. So that's a product of this specific attitude toward education that, for whatever reason, maybe the context of the Mandarin exams in China and similar board tests in modern and even pre-modern India, came out of that particular region. And it doesn't last forever in the USA, by the way. According to the last paper I read, Asian study culture lasts about 4 generations in the USA. So that 3 or 4 generations in, Asians start getting lazier and doing worse in school, which is kind of a remarkable finding. Like, they start pacing themselves against their white and Black schoolmates. And so you start seeing, they still do well, but you start seeing this really exceptional performance kind of tail off.
Yeah, I wanted to make a quick comment that's just fun, and I want to make sure I get a chance to drop his name in. Okay. Johnny Mosley is the first Puerto Rican to ever win a winter gold medal in the freestyle skiing. It actually, his dad worked there, so he was born there, so that makes him Puerto Rican. But he grew up the third brother, the youngest brother. They went to a Squaw Valley ski academy, and he was the one that got gold. He had great timing, and so yeah, he'd think like, oh, he's a Puerto Rican who won a gold medal. They'll dig a little deeper, and there's something there. And I guess that sort of takes us into another area I wanted to talk about, and I wanted to bring in author Judith Rich Harris, who talks about the nurture assumption. I don't know if you're familiar with this book, but when she goes into her science and behavioral studies, she notices that there's just not a lot of room for parents to impact kids. You know, when you take in their environment, you take in genetics and everything else, the wedge left to reliably make a kid into something, there's just not enough there to reliably and repeatedly do it. Not that a parent can't do it, not that a parent can't screw their kid up, but she doesn't allow for much parent control at all, although there is some, right? And so the amount of work it must take to get those kids through that tiny wedge of influence and out on the other side, that must wane over the generations.
Yeah, I mean, so I'm a little confused there. So you're saying that any kind of cultural training as we study or something like that, that effect is going to get smaller?
Judith Rich Harris is going to say that. Yeah, she's going to say that the amount of impact a parent has on their kid's positive upbringing, because obviously you can abuse the hell out of a kid and ruin them, but you can't reliably insert yourself in there because of their environment, the kids around them, the genetic makeup of the kid. You have 3 different kids, 3 different genetic makeups. These are all your own kids, but they're all different. And so to get them reliably through this Asian overstudying thing is going to wane over. It's going to regress to the median, is what I'm saying. That's what Judith is saying, really. I'm just taking her thing and applying it to this model of multi-generational regression to the mean on study culture.
Yeah, so I'll be completely honest about this. I think this is a really interesting topic, like a lot of this cult hered crit stuff. And I often feel like humanity doesn't really know all of the answers here. I've been arguing about some of this stuff the past couple of days on Twitter, Facebook, so on down the line. And a lot of people really pretend to a level of confidence, in my opinion, that I don't think people really have here. So one of the things that I've really guided myself by pretty much my whole adult life is the idea that things that seem to be commonsensically true are true. And I mean, I grew up in the hood and I'm pretty stable as an investor now. So that as a guideline for my almost bets has worked really well as an adult man. And I'm probably going to stick to it. So when I see a lot of topics that are debated in modern society, for example, do good cops, coherent armed policemen reduce crime? The answer seems to be obviously yes. Does having an open border increase illegal migration? But the Biden administration currently is actually trying to argue that there aren't enough studies, quote unquote. There's no definite proof of that. The answer is obviously yes. I mean, if you talk to illegal migrants or watch videos of young guns crossing the border on social media, I mean, people are saying like, gracias, Biden. Like they're implying that the new softer policy is the reason they're there. And I have a similar attitude toward the thing I've been debating, which is the idea of whether studying for tests improves your score on tests. I mean, like the idea of if your parents strongly insist on a certain level of academic performance, will that improve your level of academic performance? The obvious answer there, the studies may be questionable depending on n size and that kind of thing, but the obvious answer there seems to be yes. So, like I actually pulled up this conversation on Twitter, and there's a whole body of research that finds that a lot of different things seem to impact the IQs that people have. So I've been looking at this French study. Let me pull this up. This is Science Direct. Christian Capron and Michel Douaimet, back in 1996, they actually looked, and it's not a giant sample size, but it's certainly dozens. They actually looked at differences in IQ between kids who were adopted by sort of stable upper middle class families and the pretty much the same kids, siblings, if not twins, who were not. And what they found is that well into the teenage years, I mean, you're talking about 168 months past birth, the kids who'd been adopted, the kids who were in the stable families, had IQ scores that were on average on what's called the WISC, the intelligence scale for children, that were 12 to 16 points higher than the kids who had never been adopted. And that's about what I would assume, right? And there are a bunch of other studies like this. There's a study done in Norway, similar adoptee patterns, looked at more than 2,000 men, found, I believe, a 5+ point gain, so a little smaller. But you also have to look at the fact that the adopted kids were in circumstances that weren't as dramatically different from the ones that their siblings were probably in. I mean, so at a baseline level, it seems pretty apparent that a lot of this cultural stuff is going to affect how you do on board tests and other exams. Just to finish the point that I started with here, the hard hereditarian perspective on all this would almost be spending 2 hours a day instead of an hour a day studying the exact things that are on the major exams, like verbal logic games, plane geometry, so on, will have no impact on your score on those exams. And I think you and I have both spent hours like trying to dribble basketballs behind our back and that kind of thing. Like that just doesn't make sense. There's no way that's true. Like if I had to guess at a list of things, and again, I'm not the apex scientist on this. I'm more than willing to look at, this show gets a lot of viewers. It's going to get a lot of views on my page. Send me articles on all sides. But it just doesn't make sense that studying for tests for 2 hours a day is not going to improve your test scores. I don't think that's true. There's at least as much evidence on our side on, team cult. If I had to guess, I would say that pretty much Sowell's category of things is the list of, forgive me, shit that will boost your IQ or that can impact IQ. I mean, he talks about isolation. So if you're talking about the lowest white IQs in the USA, they're almost always found in Appalachia. They're in isolated mountain communities. There's less exchange. There's less scholastic interaction with other people. Geography can have some impact. I actually think Sowell overvalues that. But again, if you put in mountains plus isolation, you're going to see additional impact on IQ, Albania, some of the Central African states, that kind of thing. An obvious one is years and level of education. People can debate study, but there's a very easy proxy for that, which is how long you go to school and how good your teachers are. And no one even denies that impacts your test scores. That's why the IQ tests get tougher and the board tests get tougher as you go up year by year. That's why the PSAT isn't the SAT and the SAT isn't the GRE. I mean, so that the idea that consuming more information in a competitive environment makes you smarter, that right now I would get an almost perfect PSAT score. No one really disagrees with that as a general point. Do you educate women? People have a lot of complex theories like cousin marriage about why the Arabs get surprisingly low IQ scores. I mean, essentially, they're a Caucasian group that's fairly near Asia, fairly wealthy. You'd expect them to do well. You see a lot of 92s. The one time I looked at this research, a simple guess for me, now that you have to test both men and women, is that there's not a lot of focused education of women in those societies. And I've never seen, a feminist writer look at that. But a bunch of other stuff, your attitude toward alcohol and drugs and diet, especially before birth, but also later in life. Are you using that stuff? Family structure. Is your father present? How you're taught as a kid, words heard, the number of books in the house. This really gets into like the blah, 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 my eyes glaze over zone. But Sowell goes through all these. And again, I think it's obvious that combined, there's a massive environmental impact on kids. Your initial question was just how much of a role the mom alone can have. I would say that if you kind of combine literatures, and so you look at what we're talking about here, like the adoption literature, or some of the papers about the test scores of kids raised by white instead of black mothers that are multiracial, I'd say that there has to be an impact there. And again, that seems to logically congru. So, I mean, I'd recommend for those interested in this, reading all this stuff, like reading the nurture stuff about environment, but then reading, the literature that shows that parents have an impact, the Asian study lit, all of that. Like, none of these theories are evil or wrong. There's just, there's a lot of evidence that's out there, and a lot of it's contradictory.
Yeah, and thanks for going down the road with me, because it does go to this overall thing. One of the things that Sowell talks about is the way people use data, and he talks about just the assumptions that go in to an argument as opposed to the empirical data. You talked about the many variant analysis that he does, whether it's age or education or whatever it is. And so you do have to do these things. But again, I think part of his critique is that we slide away from this. We talked about this last book. It's the lack of rigor. And maybe there is a variant that is bigger than the others, but you should be accounting for these things, right? And so when you look at Sowell's work, it's often that we look at someone's empirical work and say, there's some mistakes in there. Is that true for Sowell in any of his books, but in particular this one? Are there things that we see now 30 years later, like, he didn't control for this?
Well, I think that so first of all, I mean, obviously there are always innovations in the science that someone writing within a particular era, even someone as impressive as Sowell, isn't going to be able to take into account or to plan for. I mean, like right now, when we're looking at the IQ literature, you have what's called GWAS, where people are actually looking at the correlations between specific genetic alleles and intelligence. So at some point, I mean, we probably will see a resolution of the cult hered debate. And, I brought this up with a friend on the other side the other day, and he was like, it'll just be 50-50 down the middle, like everyone knows. And I don't agree with that, by God. But I mean, like, eventually we are going to see some of these debates resolved. We're going to see some of Sowell's claims disproven. I don't really think that Sowell could have expected that or prepared for that, for a new technology that would be able to kind of examine humans at the submolecular level. So I don't hold that against him. If I were going to give a critique of Sowell, it's that he never actually models in the sense of using regression analysis like I do. I think you have a lot of the things he says. So Sowell will say something like, when you look at wealth differences among groups, you have to take into account age. So, I mean, the figure that I always drop is that the modal average age for a black man is 27, white man is 58. That doesn't close the gap entirely when you're talking about homicides post Black Lives Matter, but it has a very significant impact when you're talking about income earned per year or something. You have to adjust for region. Far more of the Black and Hispanic population lives in the lower income Southwest than the white population proportionally does. You have to adjust for test scores, so on down the line. And Sowell makes that point better than almost anyone I've seen, but he doesn't actually run the models, if that makes sense. So very often Sowell will have these data sets as part of having prepared his book. And he really could have, if he was fully familiar with that tech, I assume, just tested his question and seeing what the answer was. And he doesn't really do that. He more throws out an idea. He'll say, well, this is obviously the case. If you adjust for age, region, and test scores, there's almost certainly no gap at all. and sort of wait for other more quantitative scholars to do that. The issue with that was that because Sowell was perceived as being a man of the right, very often he would say obvious things that no one ever then did subsequently test. And actually, one of my goals is to test some of them.
Mm.
Like when I've looked at that, and I mean the impact of what you could call the Sowell factors on income, he's absolutely right. I mean, that's data that I've broken down to some extent. I mean, June O'Neill, a well-known centrist economist, has also done that. And I mean, what she finds is that there's about a 1% difference in white and black earnings if you adjust for just, I think hers were age, IQ scores, board scores would work as well. But region, obviously, and just education, like not level of your school, but just years of completion. Did you get a high school degree and so on? So once you adjust for those things, there's almost no room for racism to dramatically impact incomes. But Sowell himself generally doesn't run those analyses. Other than that, no real critiques. I mean, the guy wrote 70 books, or 62 books in 40 years. I mean, I'm on 3, and I'm a much more productive than average writer. So it's hard to kind of kick the goat around too much.
Let me ask you something else too. In reading, and I haven't read all of Sowell's books. I haven't read all of Peter Drucker's books. These are leading figures from the last 70 years of academics. But the one of the things you notice that he rings the same bell quite often: Chinese and Malaysia, Irish, different Irish things, the religious impact on Irish and their own internal divides. He goes to the same tools quite a bit. And look, you get to do this because you gather the data, you get to process it and publish it however you want to do it. But is he overusing his earlier work and all that data that he's gathered? If you gather it yourself, it's suspect a little bit, but he does. I don't want to say he's a one-trick pony because he's incredible, but there is a lot of the same arguments being used over and over again.
Well, I mean, first, there is that natural feeling. I mean, if you're a social scientist and you have a 400,000 unit data set looking at, Malaysian recipients of affirmative action, you're probably going to drop that as often as you can. I mean, you're not just going to throw that beauty away. But I mean, in reality, no, I think there's a reason that Sowell uses the case studies he does. Jews in America, or the Americas, also a very common one, Italians in Latin America. What he's trying to do, I think, is make the point about the impact of culture where racism can't credibly be cited, and very often where genetics can't credibly be cited. I mean, we would call them both Asian, but you could at least coherently argue that Chinese people and Malays are genetically distinct. But it would be very difficult to do that with Italians and Argentines, for example. I mean, the only factors that could produce a difference in performance are 1, a slight immigration or exodus effect, and 2, culture. So, I mean, he looks at these situations where that's clearly the case, that's testably the case. And also there are major differences in performance, if that makes sense. And then he looks at the cultural variables that are causally responsible for those differences in performance. So, I mean, in the context of Italians and Jews in Latin America, where you literally have 3 Levantine or Latin groups of people that have all immigrated and that are all in the same destination country, the advantage that he finds for the Italians and the Jews, in addition, again, to the slight immigrant effect, is willingness to work, which is just a really interesting point. And a lot of my Hispanic friends that read Sowell are a little insulted by this. Like, what, you think we're lazy? But he's making the point that in a lot of these New World post-slave societies, work became devalued. Work was the thing that, excuse the language, slave boys did. So among blacks in the South, among poor whites in the South, this is all very trackable. Among people of more than half Spanish descent in Latin America, so on, you can ask questions about, like, do you value work? Like, do you value a hard day's physical labor? And any American Protestant yeoman, white, northern, black for that matter, English, German, they're going to say yes. In those groups that I've just described, everyone's going to say no. The goal is to move to, quote unquote, a soft hands job. The goal is to be the boss over, quote unquote, the boys, the guy with the whip. And so in Latin America, that cultural difference among people that, tested pretty similarly on the IQ boards for 3 or 4 generations, among people that often were very similar in terms of background, Italy versus Spain, that difference proved very, very productive. So he goes through this whole thing about in Buenos Aires, I believe, by, date X. I don't have the book right in front of me, but more than 50% of all deposits in the Bank of Argentina belong to Italian and Jewish immigrants. Right. I mean, so like all of these massive, and many of the native Argentines were extremely wealthy. I mean, Latin America was to some extent a plantation society, even in that more European descent country. But the whole idea of I'm going to set up a small shop, I'm going to make a large amount of money, I'm going to put some of it into investments, I'm going to trust the bank. That was a cultural praxis that didn't exist there at that time. And that really advantaged those groups. And when you look at Latin America, like you're pretty familiar with Latin America, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, you've got a lot of groups down there that you wouldn't expect to be bosses, but that are, like the Japanese. I mean, I believe it's Peru that's had a Japanese, Latin American president, Fujimori. So all of that doesn't have anything to do with the fact that if you're a recently arrived Italian or Japanese immigrant with all your possessions in a bag over your shoulder, you're not facing discrimination. That has to do with these cultural and other variables.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier the word Hispanic, and he specifically mentions this in the book, and he talks about how it's an invented group, and that's not what he said, but that's what he basically says, and all of a sudden it becomes a group because it becomes studied, it becomes valuable to be part of it, but we don't do that with Germanic. I don't know what the French term is, Frankic. I don't know. Not really with Arabs. We don't really, because we don't even know what an Arab is, even though Arabs are an ancient people and have been around for thousands of years. So when you take these groups and you artificially create them, or they artificially are isolated and say this is an important group. I mean, at some point, anybody who is Hispanic is actually Latin or Greek or both, right? I mean, like you just go up the Indo-European chart of languages, and you suddenly are part of a bigger group.
Well, yeah. I mean, a lot of the census groups used in the USA really aren't all that meaningful. I mean, so first of all, and I get some backlash on this occasionally, but as a black businessman, I would point out that to me, most Hispanics are white. I mean, about 66% of the Hispanic census category self-identifies as white. So, I mean, a lot of this actually gets into a broader point, which is whether population demographic change in the USA is this big upcoming disaster. And I don't think it is, honestly. I mean, I have no problem with, the Anglic founding stock and all that. And by the way, there often are simple amoral solutions to problems. I mean, there are countries that only allow immigration that matches their current demographic pattern. Like, we could do that and make everyone reasonably happy. I'm not necessarily endorsing or rejecting that, just saying, leaving that aside, though, the idea that we are seeing a massive population shift that's just completely unavoidable, reshaping the country, that's something that's been said during every past wave of immigration that's not really accurate. I mean, so the largest immigrant group is Hispanics. Let's say 60% of whom are white in conventional terms. The rest are mestizo, white and native, a group that hasn't traditionally faced brutal discrimination here in the USA either, post the wars. The second largest group entering the USA is Asians of various kinds, who are the highest performing people in the country. So that's, 17% of the population is Hispanic, mostly Caucasian, 7% is Asian, outperforming everyone else. Another group, which I would fall in, 5% or more of the population is biracial, mostly half white. So the idea that we're dramatically shifting the country in the sense that everyone here will be Filipino or Nigerian within 40 years, that's simply not accurate. We would have slightly darker toned Caucasians in larger numbers, concentrated in half the country. But so the reason I brought all this up is, the Hispanic category itself doesn't mean much of anything. The census designation that I understand is just anyone that speaks Spanish fluently as a first language. So, like a Brazilian is not a Hispanic. And this actually has a lot of impacts you wouldn't expect, because since most Hispanics are Caucasian, Brazilians don't qualify for affirmative action because they're just white guys that don't fall in that Hispanic box. They're a quarter black or whatever, but that's how they are census designated. So, there's not a lot of sense there. There's not a lot of sensibility to the AAPI category either, which is every Asian group, every South Asian group, and every Pacific Island group. So, you can make that point.
It's also interesting to note that we look at things like Hispanic or whatever, but we don't look at, like, say, Mediterranean. because
Oh
the
yeah.
Mediterranean is a very small place. So Rome to Tunisia is 750 miles. From where you live to Houston is 200 miles farther, right? And you don't live that far from Houston in terms of culture. Like there's can be a lot of similarities. Why is it that America gets so hung up? By the way, Israelis are Asians, and so are Azerbaijanis and all these other people that are
Really?
part of Asia, but we don't call them Asians. We've talked about this before, but
No, yeah.
when you look at things like race and culture, it isn't. These terms do matter if we're going to get upset about one group over another group.
Well, I mean, like one of the so I mean, almost everything I say is controversial at some level, either from the Kendi Angelist left or kind of the hereditarian right. But like another point that I would make that'll get draw some arguments that's essentially correct is that genetic race does exist. It's not some fantastical idea. I mean, you can go to a website like 23andMe and get your full racial profile. I mean, you just put your blood on a tab, and for me, it'll tell me that I'm 40% Bantu, 40% Celtic, 20% Plains Indian. Like there aren't a lot of mistakes being made. The question is just how you define a race. So they have, I think, 108 up from 70, and I'm sure some junior exec from the company could correct that. But let's say 100 regional haplopopulations, which just essentially are what you think of as ethnic groups, and that's where something like Southern Italians would fall. But you can put those groups into larger consolidated categories. I mean, the categories they use are European Caucasian, West Asian Caucasian. After some controversy, they might have dropped the Caucasian, but the words mean the exact same thing. So European, West Asian, Han or East Asian, so on down the line. And those groups are actually meaningful. Like your Mediterranean group would basically just be West Asian and Southern European Caucasians. Like that would make as much sense as many categories that we do use. In fact, there's been some proposal that something like that be constructed. It's called MENA, which would be Middle Eastern and North African. There's a political element to that where like Turks would be included, but Greeks wouldn't. That just gets into infighting in our society. But we essentially are talking about a Mediterranics category to go along with Latinx. So, I mean, in that sense, race is pretty meaningful. The sense in which race is not meaningful is the sweeping. I mean, like Hispanic is right on the verge of being useful because it includes people that in practice are purely native and people that are purely white. But I mean, AAPI is an example of a language-based or regional category that's just useless. So, I mean, within that category, you'd have an Indian person and then someone who's Guamian or Chamorese, and then someone who's Chinese, and then someone who's Samoan warrior-looking guy, and all of them would be considered to be Asian. So does that mean anything? No, not really. But that doesn't mean that you couldn't take the East Asian groups out of that category and put them in a meaningful racial category. And again, all of this ties into the sole distinction between race and culture as we read the conversation. Like I would assume that, in fact, I know that there are many shared cultural points like attitude toward work, level of alcohol use, use of the Spanish language, quote unquote, macho attitude toward women, formerly stereotyped as lazy workers prior to, some adjustments against the heat, now stereotyped as hard workers, so on down the line. There are a bunch of things that would unify the Hispanic category that are cultural, but that doesn't mean that all Hispanics are the same race. What you've got there is an ethnic group that's being labeled as a racial group, essentially.
I want to do a breakdown of these chapters here in the book. There's 8 chapters, and when you look at 5 of them are race and economics, politics, intelligence, slavery, history. All of the rest, the other 3, have culture and a worldview and everything like that. Do you think that structural design is because Sowell has more to say about race and what is and isn't race, and trying to smash that down? Because look, culture is complex, and all you have to do is, if you were to ask your students tomorrow and say, I want you all to write down your individual definition of culture in 10 words or less, you would get 10,000 different answers, and you don't have 10,000 kids, so they would all be so confused, right? It's not an easy thing to sort out. So why do you think Sowell took on 5 chapters of the 8 to deal with race?
Yeah. So looking at these comments, you're good, Pete. Will not so good. That's probably a reference to me not being like.
When we first Yeah, when we first started, I think. I don't know.
Oh, okay, that makes more sense. Yeah, it's like, what the
Yeah,
hell?
yeah, yeah, yeah.
I think
This
conversation's going pretty well.
sound check, right? Yeah, yeah.
Okay,
Because
boom.
Brad does sound checks for me. But yeah, this breakdown of chapters, I
Yeah.
was trying to sort out why he spends so much time on race over, and I think culture is the element here, and whereas race is a compound of elements, and I don't know what the other elements would be for race, but culture is really it's at the root of everything we are. There's DNA and there's culture and there's some other stuff, but that's a prime thing. So why does he spend so much time on race as opposed to culture?
Well, I think the framework is Sowell almost knocking down some racial straw men and then explaining what he thinks of as the actual cultural causes. So, like the
Okay.
chapter Race and Slavery, we in the USA tend, and this is very inaccurate, in fact, it contributes to racial tensions, to think of slavery as what happened to Black people in the Western world. And
Yeah,
in fact, slavery is one of the oldest human practices, oldest human vices. I mean, I just finished writing my new book, Lies Your Liberal Teacher Told You. And I mean, one of the things I found that was fascinating is that one of the oldest human words is the word for slave. It's like the word for man from the mountains and then the word for chains. Like, this is when they're still writing in pictographs. This is Sumerian. And the reason for that is that the great Sumerian city states, Akkad and all that, fought so many wars with the wild clansmen of the mountains that there was a constant trade in slaves who were just captured fighters going back and forth. So the Sumerian symbol for slave meant like broken enemy, and it was one of the first 5 human words. And we went on from there. I mean, the Romans were a slave society, 15% of 60 million people. The Greeks before them were a slave society. And you could, given their proclivities, you could expect some unpleasant things as a young male or female slave. You know, the Africans were a slave society. And all of this was true to such a point that there were whole historical conflicts that we've forgotten about by this point. Like, people should look up the Zanj Wars, which was a conflict between like Arab and civilized Bantu societies around slave taking, where basically the black side lost and all these people were shipped to Iraq to work in the salt marshes. And like the captured black fighting men rebelled under this crazy Arab. It's this great male kind of saga. They all fought each other, heroes on all sides, a million dead. But I mean, this is like 800 AD. And from that point forward, I mean, slavery, white slavery, the Barbary trade, black slavery, the mid-Atlantic trade, you know, Irish, I would use the word slavery there if you're looking at some of those centuries under the English yoke, you know, the breaking of the Jews, all of this continued until essentially the modern era. So in race and slavery, and I will give the West a hat tip for ending slavery. I mean, obviously, it was the British and U.S. navies patrolling the ocean sea that made the slave trade almost impossible. You know, the phrase shores of Tripoli is in the U.S. Marine Corps hymn because we got so tired of the Barbary pirates, who are mostly black, by the way, or black or Arab, raiding our ships and enslaving people that we conquered the whole country. I mean, we landed on the shoreline, burnt down. There were only like 2 cities, freed a bunch of people, killed a bunch of people, and ended up signing as an equal partner a treaty with the Bey, the Sultan. So, I mean, but at any rate, all of this went on for all of human history. So Sowell makes the point that slavery is not linked to race. There's nothing genetically about black people that makes blacks suited to be slaves. Same if this even needs to be said these days for Jews. In fact, there were many great's not the word, but notable black and Jewish slavers. Tipu Tip comes to mind. So the point of that chapter is taking the racial frame on slavery and shifting it over here. Like, that doesn't make sense. Why did slavery occur now that we know all races engaged in it? So then you move into a cultural chapter. Similarly with IQ. And again, this IQ debate is going to go on until it's resolved by modern technical tools. But Sowell makes the point that we associate different levels of intelligence with genetic race. And there's a very great deal of evidence that that's probably not true. So, I mean, for example, he goes through the military brat studies, which dating back to the 1950s in Germany have found that the multiracial children of black service members and white women in other countries where there's no hood culture and there's no racism and there's no IQ expectation perform just exactly at the norm. It's 1 point under the white norm. He goes through all this. He goes through the pretty sizable body of literature finding differences in IQ between northern blacks and southern blacks. Again, there's no particular reason you would expect that. That's not cultural. I mean, that relates to school quality, years of education. Both groups are Black. Both groups are West African descendants of slaves. You know, the fact that Black women do much better on tests of intelligence than Black men. I was surprised by that, by the way. I mean, I don't think I'm particularly sexist, but among Blacks, geniuses are 6 times more likely to be female. And again, there's just no genetic way that could be the case. That's obviously the result of forces, gang culture, and the like that negatively impact Black men. So, I mean, the race and intelligence, whether or not you think he totally conclusively proves his case, he says, well, most of what we think of in terms of IQ, when we connect that with race, doesn't have anything to do with genetics. I mean, there's an interesting passage in there about the passing of the Polish joke. So he talks about how for a number of groups like Italians and Poles, for a century plus, for nearly the same amount of time that we've seen these stagnant scores with African Americans, you saw fairly low intelligence scores that were stagnant or gradually rising. And then that pattern just stopped. I mean, like scores started increasing after World War II. They went up dramatically. And today, and there are numerical charts showing this in the book. And so today, in the modern era, Italians and Polish people just score normally. They're both a little over the national IQ. But I mean, so he mentions in passing, you know, these sort of offensive ethnic jokes that you heard in white urban groups that my Black buddies would make in New York, maybe on the way out. This is one sense. It's not the point of the book. But it's interesting to me because a couple of days ago, I was on social media and I was bantering with the writer Noah Smith. And he actually used this as an anecdote. He said, you know, at a party in San Francisco, like an older guy who was a tech executive made a Polish joke. And the punchline was that Polish people were dumb because 60 years ago, that still would have been a punchline. But today, no one got it because the stereotype of Polish people is of these smart, hard driving kids. A lot of them are newer immigrants. So the point of the chapter is that a lot of the things we link to race are mostly, if not entirely, unlinked to race and linked to culture. Again, there's no genetic way the Polish IQ increased 20 points in, 110 years without belaboring this too much. That's before you adjust for what's called the Flynn effect. So then he gets into the 3 culture chapters where he says these are the things, and they're the things we've talked about: attitudes toward education, attitudes toward drink and drugs, attitudes toward women. These are the things that predict success. Last point here, by the way, when Sowell talked about that path that a lot of Blacks and Irishmen have taken, kind of going very politically, publicly, being very critical of the dominant society, invoking race, he's very critical of that. He doesn't think that works. He thinks that held the Irish back for 100 plus years, and he thinks it's holding Blacks back today. And I tend to agree with him on that.
You got to make a shout out to Charles Gordon, who's one of the British guys who's like, I'm going to end slavery, not just in Africa, but anywhere I can find it. And, if you ever want to see some of the history you missed out on, I didn't learn this in high school. There's a good guy to learn about in terms of the lengths that people went to get rid of slavery. He gave his life ultimately, and fought a guy who thought maybe he was the magical imam. So shout out to him for doing that many years ago. We're about to run out of time on this thing, and I don't want to skip out anything that you want to add into this. I mean, obviously I can ask you some more questions, but I don't want to take all of your time today either. So is there anything that you want to get into? Should I ask you another question? Where are you at?
No, just keep asking questions.
Okay. Well, so then within the book, we talk about race and slavery, race and history. When we look at Sowell's body of work up to this point, I guess the way to ask this is this book still applicable? In a lot of ways, the same words are being talked about. He defines a racism, and he's like, you can define it as feeling superiority towards another race, or you can define it as power. These are ways of people doing. He does this 30 years ago, right? And it's a very modern Ibram X. Kendi way versus a Wilfred Reilly way of just defining these things. Is this book still relative? Is it still relevant? And why are we still fighting this fight if he's been talking about this for 30 or more years?
Well, I think that actual question there is something that, as a center-right Black guy that's gotten really good results out of Black and Appalachian students, is just infuriating. I mean, Sowell's point is basically, look, unless you're a genetic hereditarian, and he's not, there are specific cultural traits that obviously predict success. I mean, there's actually an article called The Success Sequence that's written by a well-known coach. It's about 40 years old. I'm sure we both had it read to us, but it's like, you graduate from high school and don't get your girl pregnant till you're 25 and, get a job, any job, and work it and don't get convicted of a felony. You have a 0.5% chance of being poor. And for one of my first serious articles, I actually looked at whether that's empirically true. And I thought it was going to be a little hokey, a little off from the facts. But no, that's 100% empirically accurate, at least for Caucasian and African-American men. So the idea that Sowell has said all this crap, like groups that are failing tend to blame ghost-like forces in society, I think is his description of the Black and Irish approaches. And that's not going to be successful because those ghost-like forces don't exist. You need to basically follow the success sequence. I mean, that is an extraordinarily obvious point that it is infuriating that people ignore. Like the entire Black Lives Matter 10 years has just been an example of people ignoring that. And I guess I shouldn't hate on it too much because it's kind of made me famous, like debating these guys and all that. But I mean, like in reality, a lot of people died. So it is irritating that basic Sowell ideas, like why don't you study as much as Asian kids, are so taboo, are so dissected. I mean, I think that there's really not much more to say. Like, yes, he's been saying this for quite some time, and other empiricists and quants have been saying this, and it's very problematic that people aren't doing it. The question is kind of how to make them. In terms of the definitions of racism, I think that ties into this. So what I just said is people who don't want to accept the success sequence model tend to come up with bugaboo forces that explain why they're failing. Because otherwise, how could you explain why you're failing? You're not a hereditarian either, and you reject culturalism. So you've got to find racism somewhere. I think what you're seeing with the changing definitions of racism is a reaction to the fact that there's much less traditional racism than there used to be. So racism was generally defined as a belief in the inferiority of another group, A, combined with dislike, B. I mean, I think it's a simple, fair way of putting it. Like, I think whites are weak and bad in bed, or I think blacks are stupid and lazy. And I assume these two would almost always go together, and I hate them. That's what a racist was. A racist was someone who wouldn't hire Hispanics because they thought that they were lazy, incompetent, so on down the line. Today, that's honestly pretty rare. I mean, about 6% of whites, about 10% of blacks still test as racist. But in reality, it's considered uncool, for want of a better word, in both groups. It's a lame thing. It's something you don't want to be associated with. It's one of the worst labels you can call someone. So people have been forced to redefine racism to mean things like any level of prejudice combined with power. Even that was like the 90s OO's definition. What we're getting to now with Ibram Kendi is kind of almost purely causational in the philosophical sense, right? Like Kendi is saying, if that's the term for it, Kendi is saying that any system that produces disparate outcomes is racist. Like, not necessarily that it has racists in it. I mean, I've confronted him directly about this on social media, and he'll deflect you pretty skillfully, but just that it produces negative results. So if you have a system of welfare designed to benefit black people, but in fact it contributes to a higher rate of single motherhood among blacks than whites, even though you are a black mayor giving black people money and denying white people money, you are being racist toward black people. That would be the Kendi definition. And the appeal of this is that by this standard, you never get rid of racism. You will always be able to blame racism for your problems because you've defined racism as any system that includes a problem.
Yeah. I was one of the times when you dropped out, I was talking about Murray's 3 laws for social change. And, he talks about the selective bias, like the people that you try to select to help out with your social program, you end up excluding those people. You end up trapping more people into that problem because of this. You get these, horrible outcomes. And Murray's another one of these guys where he's not just a social scientist. He's using data and he's looking at economics and just pointing out a very obvious thing. Like if you want to, it's a law because if you want to reduce poverty, if you start a poverty program, you're going to create more poverty, right? And you're going to try to get black people out of poverty. You're going to ensnare more of them. And it just always happens this way. And I suppose this must just drive Murray and Well, Soul, a little bit crazy. Like, hey, we've been telling you guys, these are not stupid people. These are brilliant people that have written a lot. You don't got to agree with them. You might take a line out of Bell Curve and get all upset about it and not read the whole fucking book or all his work. But the fact is these guys are talking about things and ways to get out of it. And usually the problem seems to be us, like ourselves, and then our community. I mean, look, the next time someone calls you something disparaging because you're a black guy that doesn't agree with them, it won't be the first or the 150th. It'll be a lot because there's people are really evil towards folks who do well, whether they're black or Asian or Jewish or anything else. So I guess my question to you is when you think about Murray and you think about Sowell, does this work matter? I mean, do these books change minds?
Well, yeah, I think it matters because it keeps an ideological framework alive that probably 45% of the country knows that helps maintain civilization. So to some extent, I mean, when people criticize Charles Murray or Tom Sowell, I mean, it's valid to say, well, the slight majority of even public pundits disagree with those guys or something like that, although I think the slight majority is wrong. But I guess imagine society without the counterpoint. You know, I had not a debate really. It was a fairly friendly conversation, but with a fairly quote unquote hard right figure. I think it was Steve Saylor recently. And this is on social media. Again, I'm very wired in, like I'll chat with you. You can hear voices in the DMs now and so on. But I mean, his comment was, even if you disagree with it, the absolute hard right should be on Twitter. And so should the absolute hockey mod booty hard left, Umar Johnson. Because if you don't see these perspectives, and I wouldn't put Steve at either those absolute extremes, by the way, but if you don't see every perspective, then it's very easy to lie about where people go. Like if social media is cut off at me, not say Jared Taylor, who I once debated or something like that, this would be Steve, then you would assume this is the furthest right, the sort of traditional paleoconservatism is the furthest right perspective in the world. Of course it's not. But then it becomes easy to label that guy as evil, knock him off the spectrum, and move on to the next guy. And the next guy would be Charles Murray. Then the next guy is Tom Sowell. Then the next guy is me. The next guy is you. You know, so that's the problem. You can, unless you're really committed to a free marketplace of ideas, there's no inherent stopping point for censorship. Like, I mean, I think we've seen from both the left and the right where one group has gone to genital surgeries for kids and another group sometimes approaches Christo-fascism literally. I mean, by the way, they're people that want a Christian nationalist government. They're not as powerful as the left. But I mean, what you see is that the slippery slope fallacy is not a fallacy. Like it very often happens. So you need to endorse open competition of ideas, where I think both of us would do pretty well holding kind of like that center right ground, one. And two, you also need to understand what society would look like without those ideas. So without Tom Sowell, without Charles Murray, I mean, you'd be missing an entire, but then you could throw a lot of people in there. Ian Rowe, Glenn Lowry, Bob Woodson, if I'm going to name some of the black giants, you'd be missing an entire generation of conservatives and business people that are going to keep the fight going. Like imagine a society that just unthinkingly adopted one of Ibram Kendi's policy proposals without thinking about it. I mean, a race war would be 20 years away. They're utterly non-functional. The idea is that every government department would work under the auspices of the Bureau of Anti-Racism run by American sociologists. We'd be at war within months. You know, I mean, so it's just that's the people countering that are providing an unimaginable service to society.
It does seem like, and again, Sowell makes these things very, very concrete and simple. You know, stay married, work hard, reap the rewards. And I'm hyperboiling that down, but it does seem like, and I'm going to be critical of the left right now, they are desperate to put 15 problems in front of the actual problem itself. So if the problem is how do we educate kids in a pandemic, they're like, hold on a second, and in an abundance of caution, let's not even get anywhere near kids in schools. Let's put all these barriers in front of them. I mean, the next time a union makes its needs higher than the kids' needs won't be the first or last. It'll continue to happen. So there's something, and I'm positive both sides do this, but it is a little infuriating from the left because they're supposed to be the party that guides us in this direction. Why do they take on so many extra problems that are inferior to the actual problem they're trying to solve? Like, look, I would love to see less fentanyl. How do we do that? Is it close the border? Okay, great. Well, then why are we getting in between that? Is it close the border? I don't know, Will, right? I'm just using that as an example. But we know it's coming from China and Mexico, so why not deal with that? Go put a brigade on the border. and quit asking the Mexican president. Just be like, here you go. Hey, would you like an aircraft carrier in the Gulf of Mexico paying attention to what you're doing? How about one? How about one down there by Cabo? We'll put one there too, and you can let us know when you want to help out. So anyhow, that's just my little ramble there. But the ability to put 15 problems in front of the actual problem, to include racism, like when racism becomes an actual problem that we can put our hands on and say this was one thing we're going to fix, it won't in any way change the big problems.
Yeah, I mean, so that I think that the issue you're getting into there is something that is a good faith mental fail on the left, and I mean that seriously. The big issue with leftist paradigms like modern sociology, if I really had to unpack this as a decent academic myself, is the underlying idea that losers are always the good guys, sort of. That whenever you do something, that is the result of some external social force. It's not due to individual agency. It's not due to small or large group culture. It's not due to genes. It's due to some kind of external pressure. And where that logically leads you is to the idea that if you see someone failing, someone must be oppressing them. So you should sympathize with the failure. Once you understand this, a lot of previously inexplicable shit becomes commonsensical. Like, why do leftists invariably defend scumbag criminals? Like, and I don't want to put an initial label on him just after death, but like we talked about the Jordan Neely case earlier on. This is just one of many. Like Jacob Blake, probably the most prominent of these cases after George Floyd, was literally a rapist, at least an accused rapist. The cops were called on him because he went back to his rape victim's house and got into a fight with her. He then fought the cops for 3 minutes and was shot non-fatally, very skillfully, while he was going for a large knife. Why would you take someone like this and make them a hero, make them an icon? It's embarrassing to me as a black guy. Why would you do it? The answer is because you assume that there's something that made Jacob Blake do that. So if you assume that someone's failure is self-evident res ipsa loquitur proof of someone else's evil, that puts you in an interesting place, because then you have to define the bad guy as the good guy and move on to try to find the real bad guy, which is invariably white people or something like that. But that's true. But that's what you see with all these, or I've discovered myself recently, well-off men, people with penises. I mean, there are plenty of categories we all fall into: armed people, useful citizens, taxpayers. But I mean, the problem with all this, first of all, is that it's false. I mean, people do have free will. And in fact, most psych research these days indicates this. The term used is agency. Of course, small group culture plays a role. The culture of the hood is very real. Of course, genes play a role. If you're predisposed toward chronic schizophrenia, you're very likely to harm people, so on, so on, so on. But even beyond that, the problem with this root causes narrative is that it prevents you from solving very simple problems that are right in front of your face most of the time. So like the issue with the border may at some deep level be caused by corruption in Latin America, which may at some deeper level have been caused by the brutal colonial wars where Spaniards and Aztecs slaughtered one another. That's all very interesting. That's a fine historical gray study. But the simple reality is that the conflict right now is caused by the fact that we opened our border. And that's what's letting the fentanyl in that's killing our people, who are the people that I care about. So you could simply stop the flow of fentanyl by doing what you said: posting armed troops at the border, building a wall, for that matter, bribing the Mexicans. Why aren't we doing that? Because the people that are pursuing the root cause analysis want to fix problems that are, one, unfixable, and two, that don't have anything to do with what we're seeing.
Yeah, it's much like the climate change thing. Continue to change the terms and never tell us what the goal is. And if you act in an environmentalist like I have, they'll say, hey, how about 400 parts per million with carbon? We can manage that. But we don't ever get to that point because there's never any point. And that becomes exhausting. And so you start to, every time I hear existential crisis, and I'm like, really? My life is pretty sweet. Look, I'm not a super wealthy guy, but I live in Orange County. I saw The Cure last night at the Hollywood Bowl. I don't know what existential crisis is out there for me. Look, I've been in a head-on collision by a tank. That was an existential crisis, but that's about it. Otherwise it gets crazy. Also, a curious note too, I think geography and who lives around you helps too. I'm at a Cure show, right? And there's all kinds of kids with white makeup on their face. There's old dudes like me, and then tons of Mexican dudes.
Oh yeah.
Who would know? It's because we live in California. There's some of these, just 3 nights of sold out shows, 18,000 people every show. It's going to be a segment of society because that is what our society is. And if we don't, let's just keep talking. If we don't feel like that's true, then you need to get out into society more and go go down the street to your Arab restaurants. And if you don't know where they are, well, there's the first step. Go encounter those folks. And you're going to find out they're folks. If you ask them their immigrant story, if they've got one, it's going to be beautiful and hard and challenging. And all you want to do is root for these folks and go support their business, whatever. So just in general, I would say we can solve a lot of these problems by getting out of the house, getting off the phone, not worry about Twitter, and just go really encounter people where they're at and maybe ask them what keeps them up at night. You know what it's not going to be? Anything Joe Biden or their representative says. And by the way, all of my representations at the federal level, none of those folks ever talk to me. I can write all the emails I want. I get no response. That alone tells me enough right there. These folks aren't representing me. They're representing something. And if I'm not the problem, or if I'm not the problem that they can help solve or fix, then I have to vote for somebody else. And yeah, that's just my little thing and way of kind of doing my post-amble to close out the show. But I guess I'll give you the mic and let you answer on that. And then if you want to, we could talk about middlemen, but I don't want to take too much of your time.
No, yeah, I mean, on that, I basically agree. So, like, just one very quick comment on that. Like, one of the negative effects that diversity does have is that it reduces trust, meaning that people are less likely to put down the phone and go outside and talk to their neighbor. The solution to that, assuming that your neighbors aren't criminals and so on, assuming they are normal people, modern Arab immigrants certainly fall in that pool. The solution to the diversity problem is just encountering people in that group like 4 times. That's a genuine answer. Like people, Robert Putnam have written about this. So yeah, like if you feel a little isolated and a little depressed, don't go into like unsafe ghettos, but just getting out of the house and talking to people. Like I play a lot of pickup basketball, and that's actually a great way to meet people that are like white guys, black guys, Spanish guys that are all obviously normal, mostly former athletes. They're sitting by the court drinking beer and lemonade. And when you talk to these people, you realize they actually are just normal humans. Now that relies on some social preconditions. Like, I mean, in, Frankfurt, there's an unofficial but very real, you can't bring weapons to the court sort of rule. A lot of people that play are off-duty cops and so on. So, I mean, like society has to reach a certain level of function before diversity and tolerance can occur. But once it does, almost everyone you meet doing a normal thing in a church, in a bar with their girl is going to be a normal guy. Yeah, that is correct. Almost everyone you meet doing normal things will be a normal person. Again, that doesn't mean if someone's filming a death metal or hip hop show at 2 a.m. in some sketchy neighborhood and, quote unquote, Indian country in the old terms, you would just pick up 15 guys and go there and not expect to get into some kind of conflict. But in day-to-day life, that sort of thing is very rare. And most people are pretty good people.
Yeah. Yeah. Anything else you want to say in closing?
Yeah, no, not really. I mean, you mentioned middleman minorities very briefly. I do think that's another interesting cultural phenomenon. So one of the things Sowell does that I'll give him some credit for, maybe as my last comment, is bring up a lot of the taboo things that we're still not supposed to talk about today. So he mentions that racial violence almost always goes from the poorer group up to the richer group. So like this whole narrative of whites murdering blacks is not real, hasn't been real since the lynching era. Even then, I mean, there were 4,876 lynchings all time, I believe. I mean, the total number of people, about half of them black, that were murdered last year was 22,900. So, I mean, in general, with interracial crime, you're going to see targeting of wealthy people by poor people. He says that. He also points out that the groups that draw the most hostility aren't like the wealthiest whites in their mansions or even the wealthiest blacks, these star athletes and rappers and business people that have now $2-3 billion. They tend to be people that are just a little richer than you. So like the most targeted groups historically have been lightly armed, upper middle class, middleman populations. And a middleman is someone that provides a service to generally working or poor people for a slight enhancement of price. So the thing with the Jews historically was that they were the money lenders, but they weren't alone. You had in West Africa, there are groups like the Igbo that do that. In much of tropical Southeast Asia, it was the overseas Chinese, and every one of those groups has had the same pattern. They've gotten pretty wealthy. They're associated with high IQ, and they're also attacked all the time because people see them as like the real agent of oppression, the Jewish landlord in Harlem, much more so than they see the king on his throne surrounded by, the carved gold lions, if we're talking about Thailand, that's seen as either a figure of the country, a symbol of the country, or as someone so distant you don't imagine them at all, as versus, Moishe next door who has a slightly bigger apartment.
And also, Moishe probably gives you a better deal than Ricky, who is your cousin, when you borrow money from him. Sowell says that too. He's like, hey, these middlemen are good at this. Everybody else is pretty evil at it,
Yeah, well, that's actually that's a very important point that race and culture makes, which is that there is an argument for diversity as well, which essentially is that if people from different cultures and even different races, because he's not dismissive of all the genetic stuff, athletics and so on, if people from different cultures and even different races are good at different things, that's an argument for big, diverse countries. You want to set a baseline for IQ and fitness when it comes to immigration, and then let in the best people from everywhere in the world. Like, there's a meme that's often presented as though it's a joke. And it's like the USA Mathematics Olympiad team beats the Chinese Mathematics Olympiad team. And the US Math Olympiad team is 4 Asians out of 5 guys saying, ha, ha, ha. But the thing is, the 4 Asians are Americans. And they're not all Chinese either. I believe the people in that meme, one is Japanese, one's Vietnamese. So in reality, if you want the best mathematicians in the world, it might be a good idea to attract some Asians. I bet if you were to look at our Olympic team, which is undefeated in the past 5 summer games, I mean, in terms of medal count, not every event, but I bet you see a lot of Nordic and Kenyan guys, and they're not from here either. I mean, the only people from here have last names like Killing Bear. And even then, you could make an argument they walked over, the Bering Sea land bridge. They're no Native Americans, but velociraptors and skunks. So it's just everyone that comes to these sort of societies contributes something different because different cultures do different things well. 70% or whatever it is this year of Italian chefs are Italian. So if you can minimize that prejudice that we all feel, that there's nothing really unnatural about, but minimize that distrust to the point where you can go down to the hoops court, the barbershop, get to know people. Once you're at that level, there is a huge advantage to being in a big polyglot society. When I think about what both my Irish and my Bantu ancestors ate, like, I don't really want potatoes every night. The seasoning is like river water. I mean, like, it sounds funny, but it's the same thing as rebelling against the sexual revolution. Like, sodomy is a sin. Sodomy is oral and anal sex. Like, you really shouldn't tell your girlfriend that's not something you ever want. I mean, it's just, we are so used to a diverse, pluralistic society that now we are criticizing, perhaps it's extremes, but there are too many ethnic restaurants. Women are too sexually aggressive. I guess a final point would be imagine the reverse.
Yeah. Well, and talking about your ancestors, whether they're Bantu or Irish, also really hard to be those guys and to risk everything to come over here, And look, maybe they had a little something saved up, but it's not an easy thing to do. And they did leave because all they were eating was potatoes. And then they got here and it turned out it was hard as hell to get here. They somehow got through, and it probably wasn't elegant or pretty. And so we always got to keep that in mind as we think about what it's like to be someone else. It's like, I don't want anybody else's problems. I've got enough of my own, and I'm just going to try to focus on my own things. Will, it's always a pleasure talking to you. I could continue to do this. The middleman thing is so interesting in terms of how we get things done. And you're right. There's a good thing with diversity, but we got to go out and be diverse ourselves for sure. Whether it's geographically, get across this big, beautiful.
The sound just gone on this computer.
Hey, thanks for watching the show. I really appreciate it. Right here, you can subscribe. Please do that. It makes the show grow. Hit that notification bell so you know which incredible guest is coming up next. Down below is the PayPal link. You can put a small subscription in. That is an enormous help. All that money goes right back into the show. And then right up over here are the next episodes you should listen to, curated by yours truly. Thank you so much.